People always think betrayal comes with shouting, slammed doors, and obvious villains. That's not how it happened with us. With us, it sounded like gratitude. It looked like pride. It felt like family. I remember the exact moment I decided to pay for his law degree. We were sitting at my kitchen table, papers spread everywhere, his hands shaking just enough to show how badly he wanted this. He kept calling it our future. He kept saying he'd make it right someday. I believed him. Maybe because I wanted to. Maybe because I needed to. If you've ever backed someone when no one else would, you already know how dangerous hope can be. Before I tell you how this ends, pause for a second. Think about the person you've sacrificed the most for, the one you defended when others warned you. Keep them in mind, because this story isn't about law. It's about what happens when loyalty is mistaken for weakness. My name is Daniel, and for most of my life I was the reliable one, the steady one, the man people leaned on when things fell apart. He was my cousin, practically my brother. We grew up in the same house for years after his father disappeared. I watched him struggle, watched him swear he'd never be helpless again. Law school was his escape plan, his armor. I already had a business by then. Nothing flashy, but solid. Long hours, clean books, no shortcuts. When he came to me with acceptance letters and a spreadsheet of costs, I didn't even flinch. Tuition, housing, books, exam fees, all of it. I told him we'd treat it like an investment in family. I didn't want interest, I didn't want control, I just wanted respect. He cried that night, hugged me like I'd saved his life. For the first 2 years, everything felt right. He called every week, asked for advice, sent photos from the campus library, coffee-stained notes, late-night exhaustion written all over his face. Then the tone changed. The calls became shorter. The gratitude turned into expectation. When I asked how classes were going, he'd correct my wording. When I gave advice, he'd smile politely and move on. "You wouldn't get it," he said once. "Law changes how you think." I didn't argue. I didn't need to be right. I just wanted him to succeed. By the time he graduated, he barely thanked me at all. At the ceremony, he introduced me as a relative who helped out. No mention of sacrifice. No acknowledgement of the years I tightened my own life to fund his. I told myself I was being sensitive. That was my mistake. Because when someone starts rewriting your role in their story, they're usually preparing to erase you entirely. After graduation, everything accelerated in a way I didn't recognize. He landed a job at a mid-sized firm downtown. Not glamorous, but respectable. Corporate litigation, contracts, internal disputes. The kind of work where words matter more than truth. I was proud of him, genuinely proud. I sent him a message the day he signed his contract. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji. That was the first time it stung. A few months later, he asked to meet, said he wanted to talk business. Those words should have warned me, but I didn't hear the tone yet. We met at a cafe near his office. He showed up late, suit crisp, phone buzzing nonstop. He looked different, straighter posture, less eye contact. He asked how my company was doing. I told him the truth. Growth was steady, some risks, some long-term plans. I spoke like family speaks openly. He listened like a lawyer listens, quiet, calculating. Then he said something that changed the temperature between us. "You should really formalize things more," he said. "Legally, you're exposed." I laughed, told him I'd been running clean for years. Contracts, accountants, compliance. He nodded but didn't smile. "I could help," he said. "Pro bono, family rate." That word again, family. He offered to review my corporate structure, my operating agreements, my contingency planning. I hesitated, but I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? I'd paid for his education. I'd watched him grow. This was just him paying me back in his own way. Over the next few weeks, we met several times. He brought documents, revised language, suggested updates. Everything sounded smart, protective. He explained things clearly, confidently. I signed where he told me to sign. One document, though, he lingered on. It's mostly precautionary, he said. Just something that gives flexibility if anything happens to you. I asked him what anything meant. He smiled. Life. I signed. Looking back, that moment feels louder than it did at the time, like a door closing quietly behind me while I was still smiling. The real shift happened about 6 months later. I started noticing decisions being made without me. Vendors referencing instructions I hadn't given. An email thread where my name appeared only in past tense. When I asked questions, people hesitated before answering, like they were choosing words carefully. I confronted him. He didn't deny anything. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look guilty. I thought you knew, he said calmly. We discussed restructuring. I told him we discussed protection, not transfer of authority. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and said something I will never forget. That's your interpretation. That's when I realized I was no longer talking to family. I was talking to an opponent. Over the next few weeks, I watched my own company slip out of my hands in slow motion. Decisions required approvals that routed through legal channels I didn't control. Banks requested confirmations that went to his firm. My title remained, but my power didn't. I hired my own lawyer, a good one, quiet, experienced. He reviewed everything in silence, page after page, no expressions, no reactions. When he finally looked up, his voice was steady. You signed this, he said. I trusted him, I replied. He nodded. Trust isn't a legal defense. The documents were airtight, at least on the surface. Authority reassigned under specific conditions. Conditions that had, conveniently, been met according to timelines I hadn't noticed. I asked if there was any way out. He paused. Maybe, he said, but it depends on something most people forget. I asked him what. He slid one document back toward me, an older one, years older, dated before law school, before graduation, before the suits and confidence. A funding agreement, the original one, the one I made him sign before I paid his first semester. I remembered it instantly. Back then, I wasn't stupid, just hopeful. I'd insisted on something in writing, not because I expected betrayal, but because I'd been burned before. It wasn't a loan agreement. It was more personal than that, more conditional. He'd laughed when he signed it, told me I was paranoid, told me he'd never forget what I was doing for him. I'd forgotten about it completely. My lawyer hadn't. This clause, he said, tapping the page lightly, was never nullified. It was never overridden. And it's very specific. I read it slowly, line by line. It outlined repayment terms, yes, but more importantly, it outlined conduct. Fiduciary responsibility, ethical obligation, a requirement that any professional action taken by him that materially harmed my financial standing would trigger consequences, severe ones, including asset forfeiture. I felt something shift in my chest, not excitement, not relief. Clarity. All this time, he'd assumed I was just the benefactor, the sentimental relative, the man who funded the dream and stepped aside. He never thought I'd protect myself. We didn't move immediately. My lawyer advised patience, observation, documentation. Let him continue. Let him believe he'd won. So I watched. I watched him sign contracts using authority he believed was permanent. I watched him make decisions that benefited him personally. I watched him cross lines that, according to that old agreement, mattered very much. And the whole time he never once checked if I still had a say. That was his second mistake. The first was underestimating me. The second was forgetting where his power came from. By the time he realized something was wrong, it was already too late. But that realization, that comes later. For now, all you need to understand is this. I stopped arguing. I stopped confronting. I stopped reacting. I started preparing. And when you prepare quietly, people assume you've surrendered. That assumption is expensive. Preparation changes the way you see people. Once I knew what I was looking for, His behavior stopped feeling confusing and started feeling predictable. Every decision he made followed the same pattern. Benefit himself first, justify it later. Wrap it in language that sounded professional enough to silence objections. I let him run. That part wasn't easy. Watching someone dismantle what you built, using rules you trusted them to protect, does something to your pride. There were nights I sat alone in my office long after everyone left, staring at the city lights, wondering how I'd let this happen. But anger makes you sloppy. Silence makes you dangerous. My lawyer and I worked methodically. We pulled transaction records, internal emails, authorization trails, not the obvious ones, the quiet ones, small decisions that compounded over time, expense approvals that routed through shell vendors, consulting fees paid to entities he partially owned, clauses he'd triggered intentionally to consolidate control. None of it was explosive on its own. Together it told a story, and stories are what courts understand best. The clause in that old funding agreement wasn't dramatic. It didn't threaten revenge or punishment. It simply stated that if he used his professional position, directly or indirectly, to materially harm my financial interests without disclosure or consent, he would be in breach. And breach meant consequences, real ones. The irony still amazes me. He'd helped draft half the modern documents that boxed me in, yet he never revisited the one that gave me leverage. He assumed time erased relevance. He assumed sentimentality erased teeth. He was wrong. We waited until he crossed one final line. It came disguised as a restructuring proposal. He framed it as efficiency, tax optimization, risk reduction. On paper, it looked reasonable. In reality, it transferred the last remaining operational authority away from me permanently. He emailed it late on a Friday, casual tone, no urgency. I didn't respond. Instead, my lawyer sent a notice the following Monday morning. Not a threat, not an accusation. A formal request for disclosure under the terms of the original funding agreement. I still remember his call. He didn't yell, he didn't insult me. His voice just sounded confused. "What is this?" he asked. I told him I was reviewing old documents, making sure everything aligned. There was a pause, a long one. "That agreement doesn't apply anymore," he said carefully. "It was never terminated," I replied. "You know that." Another pause, shorter this time. "You're overthinking this," he said. "Let's not make this adversarial." That word, adversarial. Funny how quickly family language disappears when leverage changes hands. He tried to charm his way out at first. Suggested mediation, suggested misunderstandings, suggested I was being emotional. When that didn't work, he tried intimidation. Reminded me of his firm, his resources, his connections. I listened, calmly. Then I sent him the compiled evidence. Every transaction, every email, every instance where his actions benefited him at my expense, without disclosure. Annotated, time-stamped, clean. I didn't accuse him of betrayal. I accused him of breach. The difference matters. The meeting happened 2 weeks later. Neutral conference room, glass walls, too bright. He brought 2 attorneys. I brought my lawyer in silence. They argued jurisdiction, interpretation, intent, standard defenses. My lawyer waited. Then he slid the funding agreement across the table. Not a copy, the original. He watched their faces change as they read it. That clause, the one he laughed at years ago, it was specific, brutally specific. It didn't just cover repayment. It covered conduct, and it tied consequences directly to assets acquired using influence gained through my support, including his partnership stake, including derivative income, including future earnings tied to those assets. The room felt smaller after that. He spoke once quietly. "You'd destroy me over this?" I finally looked at him. "I didn't destroy you," I said. "I financed you. You did the rest." The negotiations dragged on for weeks, not because the outcome was unclear, but because he couldn't accept it. He offered settlements, partial restitution, apologies that sounded rehearsed. I declined them all, not out of cruelty, out of clarity. He hadn't just taken money. He'd taken authority, dignity, control. He'd rewritten our relationship without my consent. The law doesn't forgive that easily. The final agreement was clinical: asset transfers, resignations, non-disparagement clauses. He lost his position at the firm. Quietly, internally, no scandal, just consequences. The company reverted to my control, fully, cleanly. When it was over, there was no victory speech, no moment of triumph, just paperwork and exhaustion. He never apologized again. The last message he sent me was short: "You didn't have to go that far." I never replied, because here's the truth people don't like to admit. Going that far usually means going exactly as far as the rules allow. Anything less is just permission. What he mistook for kindness was restraint. What he mistook for weakness was patience. And what he forgot was that I'd been building things long before he learned how to argue about them. The silence didn't last. It never does. Once the legal process moved from preparation to motion, people started calling. Not friends, not family, advisors, partners, people who suddenly wanted clarity. They spoke carefully, like the situation was fragile glass that might cut them if they touched it wrong. I answered when it mattered. I ignored what didn't. He, on the other hand, unraveled quietly. At first, he tried to keep things contained: internal memos, private meetings, a careful narrative about strategic disagreements. He was good at that. He'd always been good at shaping perception. But perception only works when the facts stay hidden. They didn't. The firm placed him on temporary leave pending review, not because they believed me outright, but because they couldn't ignore the documentation. Breach of fiduciary duty raises red flags no firm wants waving over its letterhead. He called me late one night. No lawyers this time, no confidence. "You know this will follow me," he said. I told him the truth. "So will what you did." There was nothing left to negotiate by then. The agreement was already drafted. Asset reversion, equity forfeiture, formal resignation from any role tied to authority gained through my support. It wasn't revenge. It was correction. He signed 2 weeks later, not because he wanted to, because the alternative was worse. What surprised me wasn't his loss. It was how fast people adjusted. Once authority shifts, loyalty follows. Vendors who once ignored my emails suddenly found time. Banks reverted access without comment. The company didn't celebrate my return. It just resumed, like a machine slipping back into its proper gear. That's when I understood something important. Power doesn't announce itself. It just stops asking for permission. The personal fallout came later. Family gatherings changed. Conversations paused when I entered rooms. Some people treated me like I'd gone too far, others like I'd finally grown teeth. No one asked what it felt like to be betrayed. They only asked why I didn't let it go. I didn't bother explaining. People who value peace over fairness never like the cost of justice. He tried to rebuild quietly. Smaller firm, less visibility, no leadership roles. His name still carried weight, but it came with a footnote now. The kind you don't see until you're already invested. We crossed paths once after everything settled. A charity event, neutral ground. He nodded. I nodded back. That was it. No closure conversation, no apology, no attempt at reconciliation. And strangely, I didn't need one. Because by then, I understood the real lesson wasn't about law or contracts. It was about clarity, about knowing exactly where you stand and what you're willing to enforce. People often ask me if I'd do it again, if I'd still pay for his education, knowing how it ended. The answer isn't simple. I don't regret believing in him. Belief is never the mistake. The mistake is believing without boundaries. The mistake is assuming shared history guarantees shared ethics. He thought the law made him powerful. What it really did was reveal who had been careful all along. I went back through old files one afternoon, months after everything ended. Early business plans, handwritten notes, that funding agreement. I read it again, slowly, remembering the younger version of myself who insisted on one small protection while still choosing generosity. I thanked him silently. Not my cousin, that earlier version of me. The one who understood something I'd forgotten for years. That kindness and caution are not opposites. That you can open a door without giving someone the deed to the house. Life moved on. The company grew. New partnerships formed. Stronger ones. Clearer ones. I stopped confusing loyalty with proximity. I stopped mistaking ambition for integrity. And I stopped explaining myself. Because the people who matter don't need justification. They understand that consequences aren't cruelty. They're structure. They're what keep trust from turning into entitlement. He took my silence for weakness. I took notes. And in the end, the law didn't take sides. It just remembered what was written. After everything settled, I expected to feel lighter. People talk about justice like it brings relief. Like there's a moment where the weight lifts and you finally breathe differently. That wasn't my experience. What came instead was quiet. Deep, steady quiet. The kind you only notice after a long stretch of noise. The company stabilized faster than I expected. Strong systems always do once interference is removed. Revenue normalized. Decision-making simplified. I rebuilt trust carefully, not with speeches, but with consistency. People respond to that. They always have. What lingered wasn't anger. It was awareness. I started noticing how often people confuse access with entitlement. How easily gratitude turns into expectation when boundaries are soft. I saw versions of him everywhere. Not identical, but familiar. Confident. Polished. Certain they deserved more because someone once helped them. I adjusted. New agreements were shorter and clearer. Authority was defined. Oversight wasn't optional. Generosity stayed, but it came with structure. Some people bristled at that. Others respected it. The ones who left early saved me trouble later. Every so often, someone would bring him up, casually, like testing the temperature. "He's doing okay, you know," they'd say. I'd nod. I wasn't rooting for his failure. I never was. I just refused to carry the consequences of his choices for him. That's a responsibility adults don't get to outsource forever. The strangest part was how rarely I thought about him as time passed. Betrayal feels consuming when it's fresh. Later it feels instructional. A chapter you reference, not one you reread. One afternoon, months later, I received a letter, not from him, from a junior associate at his new firm, polite, formal, asking if I'd consider being a reference for a community board position he was applying for. I sat with that letter longer than I expected, not because I was tempted, because I was curious. I realized something important in that moment. He still believed the story was unfinished, that if enough time passed, things might revert, that kindness might reappear without conditions. I didn't respond, not out of spite, out of closure. You don't reopen doors you've deliberately closed, not when you finally understand why you shut them in the first place. I kept that funding agreement in my files, not as a trophy, as a reminder of balance, of foresight, of the fact that the version of me who wrote it understood something about human nature that I'd briefly ignored. Support changes people. Sometimes it elevates them, sometimes it exposes them. The law didn't make me powerful. It simply gave shape to choices that already existed. He chose to take. I chose to stop allowing it. If there's a lesson here, it's not never help. It's never help blindly. Never confuse loyalty with surrender. Never assume shared blood or history replaces accountability. And if you ever find yourself hesitating to protect your own interest because you're afraid of looking harsh, remember this. The people who benefit from your silence will always call it kindness. The story ends quietly. No courtroom scene. No final confrontation. Just a life that continues, cleaner and more deliberate than before. If this story made you think of someone you trusted a little too much, stay with this channel. These stories aren't about revenge for its own sake. They're about boundaries, consequences, and the moments that change how we see loyalty forever. And in the next story, the betrayal doesn't come from a cousin or a contract. It comes from someone who never needed paperwork to take everything. Just patience. That one starts differently, and it ends even harder.